I am up here after our lunch with the distinct pleasure of introducing a tremendous newish friend of mine. It's been a couple of years. I always think I'd know somebody a few years. And I'm starting to really feel like I've got a tremendous friend in Jahannah James, because she was a great ally to this conference when things got a little rocky, and really put a lot into it. But when I first met Johanna, I didn't really meet her. I got to know her, as you can for people who are on the internet. We were in Egypt in 2020. It's one of the most fabulous Egypt trips of all time because it was deep COVID. They just opened the country back up. It was one of the first countries to open back up, so there were 0 tourists. We took pictures that you'll never take again because there's nobody there. So we had a great trip. But when I got on the bus the first day, somebody was pointing. I was like, "Who's that? Who's that?" And they said, "Oh yeah, she's kind of famous. She's really a content creator and out there and got a bunch of followers and had a huge Facebook fan base and all this." And I said, "Well, heck, before I talk to her, I gotta go look that stuff up." So I furtively started looking at Jahannah James. And then I got nervous. I was like, this chick is really talented, And what struck me, and I didn't know till we were just chatting a minute ago, when I told her this in Egypt, I was like, oh, I hope that didn't offend her. But she struck me as a female Jim Carrey. Has anybody else ever thought that about Johanna when you see her? You know what I mean? Whereas just God gave her a talent to communicate in so many different ways physically, and gave her the beautiful voice. And he also gave her a beautiful brain. And she's going to share with you, thank you. So we're going to take a little trip fantastic, okay? We've provided the evidence, and we'll continue to provide the evidence, that there can be catastrophes that can wipe out things that we can barely imagine, right? Because there's not going to be a whole lot of evidence yet, and certainly no one's looking for it if it were there. So Johanna's going to give us a look at what she thinks it might have looked like, what it might have been like. Who were these people in what I call, and I hope it catches on because it's sometimes the precursor civilization, that which was before. And there was something back there. And it took me a while to get my brain around that because I came from the science lane on this. But about 10 or 15 years ago, I started saying clearly there was something before. So Johanna is going to share with us what if there was that civilization and what it might have been. So a big round of applause for Mrs. Jahannah James from London, England.
All righty then. What if? Okay, so I met George on tour in Egypt in 2020. It was the pandemic. At the time, you were not allowed to leave England, so I snuck out past the border. And I'm totally on my own. I spent all of my savings joining this YouTuber called Ben, Uncharted X. I'd found him in the pandemic, and I was just obsessed. I'd fallen down the rabbit hole, and I was watching Rogan and Jimmy and Ben, and I was like, oh my goodness, Atlantis could be real. I'd heard of Atlantis, but I'd only really heard of it in the Disney sense, or in that magical place with flying cars and crystals and things. And then I heard about the Younger Dryas, and it all started, the pieces all started forming in front of me. I was like, I've got to go on the ground. I had no intention of putting out a YouTube or getting involved other than just to research what I wanted to research. I'd already been on the internet. I did sketch comedy for 5 years, and that's how I made my living. And then I brought my camera with me to Egypt, did a little vlog. I made 9 vlogs, actually. There's a lot of them. And they did really well. And with the help of Ben and the community, they really embraced me and were like, yeah, new person, get involved. We want the word out as much as possible. So that's how I got started. A little backtrack. So what if? What can we see? Here we go. So I wanted to explore the story of Plato's Atlantis. And I wanted to see if could we verify it with anything outside of Plato, because the problem is that Atlantis, named Atlantis, the island that disappeared in a day and a night in a catastrophe, it's only technically found in Plato's work. It's really hard to corroborate it, literature-wise. So I thought, okay, let's have a look in the real world, see if we can verify anything. And I'm 100% putting my tinfoil hat on for this one. I welcome you to do the same, because we've got some amazing, prestigious academics here. And I was like, I'll take the tinfoil hat. I'll do it. Because that's what it's about. And over the last 3 years that I've been doing a YouTube channel, it's got more and more almost political. like the idea of pseudo-archaeology, like that wasn't, didn't know anything about that when I started. I just dived right in, and now I'm like, oh, this is tense, there's people on both sides, it's getting very hot, it's a hot topic. But I don't mind, like I joined this for the imagination. I enjoyed this because I really wanted to write a screenplay about the Younger Dryas Comet impact. I was like, oh, this is the stuff I want to see in movies. I want to see this one day up like Titanic was. That was kind of my dream and my goal to do this. So I'm more than happy to spread my imagination and just think like, what if the story was based on something that was completely true and we hadn't really clicked on it until right now. Oh, I've got a slidey thing. There we go. That's how this works. There we go. Okay. Atlantis. Who's seen this movie? Yeah, it's an amazing piece. It's a cinematic masterpiece, in my opinion. But I think it came out 20 years too early. At the time, Disney was all into like musicals and things, and this one just came out the door, and people didn't really know how to take it. And Michael J. Fox, by the way, playing the lead, legend. But it did a bit of a disservice to Atlantis in as much as it also advertised it, because it really created this world where it was, magic and all the high-tech technology, flying cars. So when I say, oh, I think Atlantis might be real, people are like, wait, what, the Disney thing? I'm like, no, like Plato's Atlantis. So I thought I would run through the basics, the 101 of Plato's, so we're all on the same page here of what I'm talking about, looking into Plato's text, because I reread it before I came. I reread Timaeus and Critias, and I found some stuff in there that I didn't know was in there. And I was like, why are people not speaking about this? I've got to tell everyone at the summit. So we're all on the same page. Plato's Atlantis talks about this Atlantean civilization living both inside and outside the Mediterranean. Had kings, cultures, stone buildings, agriculture. They were seafaring. They had a military. In fact, they didn't have one king. They had 10 separate kingdoms with 10 separate lists of rules and almost their own cultures in themselves. A huge history with gods and Poseidon, like being the origin guy who kicked it all off. And it disappeared in a deluge. Oh, we've got some funky little text here, but that was going to be 9,000 years prior to 600 BC. We'll just, whatever. And the majority of sort of academics and people in literature, they believe it was imagined entirely by Plato, and that is the argument that I've come up against by a lot of people saying, oh, no, he just clearly, purely just made the story up, off his brain, boom, poof, like invented the entire thing. But the more I look at it and the more I look at things around Plato, I'm like, I find it very hard to believe that he actually did. So, I've also used AI, guys. I've joined Midjourney. I had loads of fun. So AI is going to help me with my sort of storytelling journey here. So this is Plato, according to AI. He's a unit. Look at that. Great. So this is Plato, obviously, writing his dialogues, and he was a philosopher, and he wrote amazing work. And it was around 360 BC, so here we go. Now, the story goes is that Plato, he says that he didn't invent the story. In fact, he says many, many times, although this story is like completely crazy, well, I am paraphrasing here, it's true, it's totally true. I got it off my distant relative, Solon. It was like 300 years before me. He traveled to Egypt, and he spoke with the ancient priesthood in Sais. Am I making that? Is that me? I'll stay away from the mic. And I heard this story that blew my mind, and this story told that there was a civilization that's older than the Greeks itself. And so this is Solon. According to AI. And Solon traveled to the Temple of Sais, and he downloaded all this information, and he then told it to a distant relative of his. Oh, here we go, I wrote it down. So Solon, and I estimated the trip, it's a historically observed trip that Solon, the real dude in real life, really did go to Egypt after he'd done what he did. He retired and did like a kind of 10-year tour, and he did go to Egypt around 590 BC. And then he told his distant relative, great-granddad Dropides, probably about 10, 20 years later. And the great-granddad Dropides relayed this story to Granddaddy Cretaeus, and then Granddaddy Cretaeus told Plato, and that's how Plato claims he knows the story. So it kind of goes through these four people. And this is AI as well. This is little Plato speaking to Granddaddy Cretaeus, learning the story. He hasn't got a hand. Oh, he's got 3 legs. Yeah. Accurate here. So one of the first things that you say when you say about Atlantis, you say that, oh, well, Plato got it from Solo. People go, oh, it's an oral story. It's an oral tradition. Like, people can't remember that well. There's no way that people could have passed down that amount of knowledge accurately. Like, there's just no way. So, you're trying to look for a needle in a haystack here. So, as I said, I reread all of the text, and it says here, little quote, "If only he'd not taken up poetry merely as a hobby, I wish that he'd finished the story that he brought back from Egypt. Because if he had, he would have become more famous as a poet than Hesiod, Homer, and all the rest." Obviously, Homer's Odyssey. He's the guy that wrote about Troy and published poetry in a similar fashion. So this was talking about, Timaeus talking about Solon, saying that he had brought back a story and he was planning to publish it. And I was like, okay, well, if you're planning to publish it like Homer did, then surely there's like a manuscript in there. So I don't know why people always say it's purely an oral story. He must have written it down. And there are many details in Plato's dialogue that I think that, yeah, it is hard to believe that it's just an oral story. But this is giving me the hunch that he'd written it down. Then I got to the next book, and turns out he absolutely did. Look, Solon was planning to compose a poetic version of the tale. It is his written version, which once belonged to my grandfather and is now in my possession. I studied the manuscript carefully. So if you hear the Greek-sounding names, now you know why. Move on that in a minute. But so there was a physical manuscript that Solon had brought back, and this manuscript got passed on to the distant relative, and that's how Plato ended up with it. So he was working not from just an oral story, but he had a physical, codex in which to transfer the information. So when it kind of completely evaporates the idea that we are basing all of this on oral stories and oral traditions, because it was written, he wrote it down. So tick 1 to credibility on that. And if you hear the Greek-sounding names, now you know why. He was explaining that when Solon heard the story, obviously it was from the ancient Egyptian priesthood, and they had their own names for Atlantis. So the word Atlantis is the Greek name that Solon invented and added to it because he was tailoring his story to his audience, know your audience. And that's why it's weird that there's a Greek-sounding names turning up in an ancient Egyptian cultural story. And that could also be one of the reasons why the name Atlantis doesn't turn up in any other text anywhere, because Solon invented the name. Because there are many, many stories that exist there of cultures that have civilizations that have disappeared. And even in Egypt itself, in Edfu, there's this huge wall. It's quite fun trying to find it. It's buried deep in the temple. It's like a temple run, and you get there, and there's this whole temple wall that is dedicated to this ancient story. And they talk about the origins of where the Egyptian culture comes from. And they do not claim themselves to have originated in Egypt. They say that they come from an island of the gods, and that was destroyed in a deluge. It's a very, very similar story. It doesn't use the name Atlantis, but why would it? Because Solon was the one that invented the name. Moving on. So ancient Sais. Again, if Plato was completely inventing the story out of his brain and was just making it up, he chose ancient Sais as the location that Solon went and got the information from. And I did a little research into ancient Sais. Turns out it's a super old place. There's Neolithic settlements there from at least 5000 BC. There is a medical school there and a women's school at 3000 BC. One of the first female doctors came out of there. She's famous because she healed a pharaoh or something. But really cool stuff that I didn't know about. It was a certifiable wisdom-keeping ancient place. It would be the very place where you would keep and hold ancient lore and information and myths, and it's just very certifiable. Out of all the places in the world that you would invent Solon to go,
it's very legit, almost university. And here it's quoted, but from long ago, every impressive or important or otherwise outstanding event we hear about, whether it happens in your part of the world or here or elsewhere, it's been written down and preserved. And here's an AI thing of scrolls, just to show that they wrote it down. Our documents record how your city once halted an enormous force that was marching against not just the whole world, no, not the whole world, the whole of Europe, but Asia as well, from beyond its base in the Atlantic Ocean. I should mention that in those days, the ocean was navigable, as in you could sail around it, since there was an island in front of the strait, and travelers used it in those days to get to further islands from where they had access to the whole mainland on the other side. In some translations, it's called the opposite continent. So they're talking about you leave the Strait of Gibraltar, which is the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, and you can kind of island hop your way across the Atlantic. And it wasn't this massive, huge one pelting journey like it would be today, that there was a route there. And this is, when I read that, this is what I envision exactly, that you're going to come out sailing with your little boat outside the Strait of Gibraltar, and you're going to hit an island, and then there you can travel to further islands out when there are Azores Islands in the middle, and then you move on to the opposite continent or like the entire mainland. And to me, that looks like America. Here's a better view. Oh, hi, Randall. A better view of the high points of the ocean floor. Randall gives evidence. I'm not going to attempt to go into the science that Randall can give on this, but there is evidence for the immersion of the Azores Plateau, because there is only tiny, weeny islands there today. But there is geological evidence that this place in the world has been going up and down. So it is not completely impossible that there were more islands, bigger islands, because the sea was a lot lower, and the ocean floor it's kind of doing this. That's the technical scientific term that I'm bringing to this. Right. Okay, so this is the only land that is above water today. Those tiny little red dots is the Azores Islands, which happen to be sitting right on top of a trifold of plates. And again, this is relevant if Plato completely invented this out of his brain and was just like, where am I going to place this story? Should I put it in like this ocean, the Indian, like where should I put it? No, he puts it bang right in the middle of the place in the Atlantic Ocean where it is like you do not want to be in like a catastrophic time in history. You've got the the European and the African and the American plates all meet in this weird little weak spot that literally doesn't happen anywhere else, just right there in the middle, near the Azores. And I was like, what is the probability of Plato just inventing a place that an island went down? And he got it on the money in terms of like geographical data. So I'm like, amazing. So the Azores as well. People are like, oh, where is Atlantis? And is it here? Is it over there? Well, I think it's a difficult, complex question because there was 10 kingdoms, and I personally think that it was a huge chunk of almost everywhere of that side of the planet. You've got people from Lower Spain, in the Strait, outside the Strait, North Africa, down, like let's not exclude Morocco, the Richat structure, and the Azores. All of it, in a sense, to me, could be the Atlantean Empire. But specifically in the Azores, it's just interesting how we don't even really get to look for it, where it is, Plato described where it was, because you're not allowed to look for it. So in the Azores' official history, it's completely uninhabited until 1424 when the Portuguese discovered it, and literally they were like, oh, nobody's ever lived here, ever again. Not true. There is an ancient cut stone in the Azores, like seriously old dolmens and cut stone that was not part of the Portuguese. There's like caves and burial sites and things that are very, very clearly man-made and very, very clearly ancient that are still just hanging out in the mountains of the Azores to this day. They found 4,200-year-old ceramics just sort of lying around. There's also this weird thing with a hole in it, which is an ancient sailing anchor that looks similar to ones used around 100 BC. So the idea that the Azores was uninhabited, I confidently clear that off the table because this place seriously was old, and we almost have no idea of who was here and when. And I'm really surprised that this stuff's sort of still staying there. There's even more. There's this caves where you have these man-made kind of holes in, and again, they're looking elsewhere. And in the Middle East, there's very similar things happening in previous millennium, and they're like, yeah, this is super old, this is man-made, and it's all just chilling in the Azores, yet it's not officially allowed to exist. There's like man-made water channels, channeling water around the Azores, which is something Plato also spoke about, that humans would have the ability to build aqueducts and bits and bobs. You also find these weird track marks, which we see in Malta. Malta's kind of famous for them. Nobody really knows what they are, but they go for miles, and people are like, I don't know, maybe for carts and stuff, but we find them on the Azores. And I'm like, that's weird. So you got it all the way in the middle of the Mediterranean, you've got track marks on Malta, and then you have it all the way out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and they're like the same, and then yet the story of Plato said that the civilization was linking the inside of the Mediterranean with the out. I'm like, okay, well, you got that weirdly on the money. The Azores also naturally have the same rocks that were described in Plato's text. Plato talks about the island having red rock, black rock, white rock, and how pretty it was, because they made like beautiful structures and houses out of all of the natural, pretty rocks that were available to them. The Azores have exactly that. They also have hot and cold springs running out of them, which is, again, another feature that magically Plato invented. And I'm thinking, how could a Greek guy who wasn't so potent, but again, nobody went to Azores, right, before like 1400, how could he know that there was islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that had hot and cold springs and black and red and white rock? It's starting to look a bit weird, right? There's evidence of ancient people living there. There's evidence of ancient water systems, aqueducts. There's aqueducts that are very definitely more like Roman as well, that are like rolling around the Azores. And also in the Ice Age, it was a hot tropical climate, which is another tick to the verification of the story, the descriptor in the story. Completely stole this from Randall's slide, sorry. The Ice Age, like the Gulf Stream, was different back in the last Ice Age. It kind of whipped up in a different way than it does today, and it warms literally that center bit in the Azores. So if you were picking somewhere in the Ice Age to like live and like build your civilization, I would go there because it's hot. Now, the seamounts are super interesting. My theory is that every ancient story, every ancient text, every ancient tale, I think it comes from a kernel of truth. As a story writer, and I write stories and I write screenplays, and everything that I write comes from a place of something that I've seen or experienced, or I've heard of someone else seeing or experiencing. It's very rare that somebody just makes something up out of their brain that they have no reference of some sort of truth to it. So this, I think, is a very good example of how the origin story of something like Atlantis or Poseidon could have occurred. You got these huge seamounts, these like ancient mountains that are now underwater near the Azores Plateau. And you can see from the left slide, they kind of look like flat-topped mountains. And on the right side, that's an image of what they could have looked like when they were originally pointy. And we've got Poseidon, who's known for having this like three-pointed trident that comes out of the water. Thank you, AI, just like that. And we're like, where could this have come from? Okay, so back in the day when the oceans were lower and the mountain was higher, the mountains would have peaked up out of the ocean. And if you were an ancient sailor and you've got the Atlantic Ocean and you're like, oh, which way do we go? I can imagine that you would head for like this three-pointed trident that's coming out of the ocean, like Poseidon's trident. And it would be a really good logical thing to navigate to, and it could be the origin source of, oh yeah, Poseidon, he's the one that built the island. I had a bit of trouble trying to get this image out of AI. It was harder than you think to just say, can I have some mountains coming out of the water, please? I was trying all these like prompts, like I want like a sort of three-pronged fork mountains thing, and it gave me that. But I was like, close enough, that'll do. Great. And back to Timaeus. I should mention that in those days, the ocean was navigable, since there was an island in front of the strait. And this is another thing that If Plato again completely made this up, he has yet again got it bang on the money. There was an island that was exactly in front of the strait in the time period that Plato is talking about, 9,000 years before his time, when this story was supposedly supposed to happen. Oops, we went a bit too far. There is an island that was called Spartal Island, and it sank 11,000 years ago with the rising of the sea level. Now, it's nowhere near as big as the description of what we get for Atlantis in Plato's text. It's only like 6.5 kilometers by 4,000 kilometers. But it's 130 meters down. And I read a paper saying that it is completely geologically plausible that it was above water and that people may have used it in this time period. There would need to be a tectonic plate subsidence of about 40 meters to make it all match up, but they again say that that's completely feasible, and like there's nothing to say that it couldn't be. So, here's the paper, so you know I'm not lying. So I'm like, wow, that's insane. So Plato wrote that there was an island. Again, what are the chances? If I'm writing my imaginary screenplay about this imaginary island, and I'm putting it in a very specific time frame, and I say that there is an island there and then there was, like, how could he have known that? It's, again, tick to the side of starting to look a bit dodgy that he made it up. Another thing that comes out as like this magical, mystical thing sometimes people use to say that Plato obviously was making up like a fairy tale was the use of this like rare, crazy metal called, I don't know how to say it, we're going to say auriculum, however you want to say it. Go you. And that, which is now only a name and was then something more than a name, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being more precious in those days than anything except gold. The wall of the citadel flashed with the red light of Well, they found it. They found this metal. It was in a sunken shipwreck. I think it was like 2017. It was off the coast of Greece, and they found this huge chunks of this really weird red gold, and they tested it, and it was this weird. It wasn't actually that like amazing. It had sort of like copper and zinc and gold in. But the area off Greece where it was found was known to be this ancient metalwork place where they would make jewelry and really luxurious things. And so again, something that Plato was referencing and including in his story is something that turns up very real in the real world, like the island and like the time frame for when he's saying a deluge occurred. Yes, we've got science now saying that, yeah, it was a crazy time. And if there was any time period in the world that an island was going to get whacked by a tsunami, it's probably going to be in the Younger Dryas. So they found the gold as well. And so yeah, it's just another point to the fact that Plato was probably not just inventing things out of thin air. He was probably, people were aware of this like rare gold. So yeah, how could he know? I've just summarized it there myself. There was in fact an island in front of the straits that sank underwater. Could that be the idea of the origin story? Has the story been expanded and developed over millennia, but the actual origin of it was indeed true? There was historical mud shoals off the coast of Africa and Spain and the Straits, because Plato describes how after the deluge occurs, it wasn't quite how the Disney movie put it. It wasn't like a huge wave and then everything was underwater. It kind of aligns with what we were saying earlier with Mark's thing, that it happened, that the actual sea rising level happened over time, that there was an event and probably a huge tsunami and things got flooded and retracted, and then a time period of it then becoming inhabitable, and people couldn't go back to what was destroyed because it was slowly indeed rising, and that there was mud shoals everywhere, and you couldn't sail there. This is what Plato says. He said it was unsailable for a huge period of time because all the mud had been unearthed, and you can see there's evidence that especially like the Canary Islands and the west coast of Africa was absolutely wrecked. I think it's the underside of Tenerife. When you look at it underwater, it's been smacked, and the underside of it has been pushed out for miles. This thing was absolutely battered by something in the past. Again, in the area that Plato made up, right? The Azores lies on the trifold of tectonic plates that show evidence of immersion and immersion. 10 points to Gryffindor, thank you. The Younger Dryas Comet theory, it supports the timeline. And again, if Plato was going to invent a story, what are the chances that he happened to place that story? Or even if Plato didn't invent it, but if he heard it, what are the chances that he heard a story or read a story in a manuscript that just happened to align scientifically with what we're finding out today? I find that so implausible that he made it up that it's shifting me over there. So what can we rule out from the story? Because there is something in Plato's story that we skeptics and followers, we can all agree on. The description of the island being bigger than Libya and Asia, or what they think would be Asia Minor. Now, they say that it was, absolutely huge. Now, we don't have evidence for a whole lost continent of the size that they are describing. So we can all agree that that part of the story, but it doesn't mean that there isn't truth to the original story. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't look or we shouldn't, just because one thing doesn't align, you don't throw all the other evidence out. But it's an interesting thing to talk about, and it is a bit of a sticking point because there simply just isn't, at the moment, we can't find any evidence for this huge continent. So either it was a gross exaggeration. Somebody in the relaying of the story, whether it was the Egyptians or whether it was Solon or whether it was Plato himself, grossly exaggerated the size of this island for their own purposes, for their own whatever. They wanted it to sound more impressive. And I mean, I also think that it's not completely out of the range of truth that what somebody would lie about the size of something to impress someone. Okay. Or it's a mistranslation of the word island, because remember, Solon was translating the words so that he was taking the Egyptian words and researching the meaning, and then he was flipping them into Greek words so that he could kind of relay it more accurately to like his audience. Maybe that's what happened as well. Atlantis is referenced in some parts of the text. It's referenced as an island. Sometimes it's referenced as a capital city on the island, and sometimes it's referenced as the whole kingdom. So it's not universally referenced the same. And there could be the possibility that the word island has been translated so many times that it maybe meant something else, as well as an island. Maybe it was like lots of islands, or a peninsula, or something else. Referring to the size of the island. That's another thing. So personally, I think what the closest thing that fits right with me is that he was describing the potentially the size of the empire itself, and not the capital island. Like we say, the size of Polynesia. We're not talking about the actual land mass of every single island. We're talking about on the globe, what is the size of it? And this is the size of what is described in the text of when they're saying that this Atlantean civilization, they were a big deal. They could sail around. They had a military, and that they had taken over parts of Spain and North Africa, right all the way up to Egypt, it says in the text. And then again, when they're talking about that you can pop over to the other island and just hop, skip, and a jump over to America. So this, when you look at it like this is the size of something bigger than Libya and Asia Minor put together. Okay, so besides Plato, is there any evidence to the truth in the story? The Younger Dryas photo that was taken at the time. This is what it could have looked like. Obviously, I'm not going to even attempt to go into any of the science of the Younger Dryas, but from what I can gather, it was pretty wild and completely aligns with the story of Atlantis in terms of its destructive capabilities, the fact that things could be wiped out to a point. We were losing megafauna, everything was going under the water. It was, it fits, the shoe fits. Again, more CCTV of what was going on. This is my very accurate AI graph of the water rising after the Younger Dryas. I thought, let's just test it. Let's see what AI does if I ask for an accurate graph of the water rising. And it gave me this, which I can only assume is in original Atlantean dialect here with the Elsay, Elaclay. There we go. And then everything was set on fire. It was a really crap time, to be honest. Photo credit, Mark Young. Because originally, when you Google younger dry ice, it had a much smaller impact zone. But now, as more research is coming out and we're getting more things out of the gate and more things are genuinely being studied, the impact zone is getting wider and wider and wider. And one of the reasons why we don't see impact sites is because purely they've not yet studied it. So I'm imagining maybe in the next 10, 20 years, as more of this stuff gets really deeply looked into, we're going to get a much clearer picture of just how wild this thing was. And yeah, so at the moment, I mean, we're middle of the Atlantic. We're just in there. We're just in the impact zone. Okay, maps with weird stuff in them. Now this is very cool. So you might know, probably aware of the Piri Reis Map, which I really embarrassingly, when I first spoke about it on my YouTube channel, I called it the Peri Map, which is, that's like a spicy food, I think, but okay. Peri chicken is big in the UK. So it's a really old source map, and it's really cool. 1513 by a Turkish cartographer. And now only a third of the map is surviving. It's already like its own Hollywood movie. I'm like, where are the other 2 pieces of the map? I've got to find them. Luke, where are you? Okay. And it's compiled from lots of other ancient source maps, which is why it's super interesting. Now, one of the reasons why it's famous, Graham put it on Ancient Apocalypse, about potentially having Antarctica along the bottom. Now, at first I was like, oh my God, amazing, well, that would be great. That's, But when I really looked into it, I found a guy that was really studying the Piri Reis Map, and I actually don't think it shows Antarctica. Because Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820, and apparently there is a decent argument that it could look like Antarctica. I think it was it the US? Someone did an aerial scan, and they officially came back saying actually, yeah, what they've drawn on the map and what the actual land mass of Antarctica, it does sort of align, actually. There is an argument for that. However, there's something cooler, I think, in the Piri Reis Map. Right, well, we'll do a quick one-on-one about maps, because I didn't know anything about maps until I looked into this, and then when you know about maps, you can see what I'm saying. So you got 3 kinds of maps: azimuthal, which the world logo there that we have on the, whatever that is it UN? I don't know, the national world logo, there it is. And azimuthal is where you have a point in the center of the map, and it's very, very precise, and then as it goes out, it kind of warps and bends and goes a bit like it's on acid. And then you've got a Mercator projection, which is like a globe, and you put it into a cylinder. And this is what we're most used to looking at when you have a nice painting of the world, or Google Maps on the flat. That's the Mercator projection. And then you also have Portaland, which is cool old pirate maps that have rose compasses in, and they look all cool. So the Mercator map, it warps things in a different way to the azimuthal. So here you can see at the equator, it's 3,300 kilometers, and then at the top, it's the same amount of distance. It just looks a lot harder to do at the top than at the bottom. And then this is an azimuthal map with a Mercator map superimposed on top of it. And as you can see, the azimuthal map starts to warp. Depending on where you place the center of your azimuthal, it will warp in a different way, but you can start to see what it's doing, which personally is what I think is happening on the Piri Reis map, that maybe one of the ancient source maps was in azimuthal design, and it's starting to do that, because it is rising at the exact point that it does in the Piri Reis, where it's super accurate to the butt end of South America, and then it starts to rise on both the north and the tail. As you get, there you go. So you can see on the right, the yellow is the actual Google Maps North American landline, and you can see that it's rising in exactly the same way on the azimuthal and below. But there's something even cooler, encoded in the map. So there's this dude, and he digitized the Piri Reis, and he's been playing with it in CAD models and really looking at it in the dimensions in a way that I couldn't do because I can't do maths. But he found out that the 2 scale bars are not the same size. So the north one measures 73.7 millimeters, and the south one 70.6 millimeters. There's a 5% difference between the scales. Now, when the map is put into a Mercator projection, like a 3D globe, like the global, the Google Maps, the scale bars match, which is something incredible so in the real world, their representation becomes more and more accurate. So in the real world, the north scale measures 1,956 kilometers, and the south is 1,965. That's a difference of only 0.4%. So when you pull it into the real world, they were accurately projecting, which on something of this scale, on these source maps at 1513, that's incredible. And the only way that you can do that is to have accurate longitude. So this is why it's a bit of a head scratcher. And this guy was like, okay, this is really weird and really exciting. The ancient source maps seem to be showing that they could do a very advanced cartography with like a Mercator projection. And the reason why that's weird is because you could only get accurate longitude after the invention of the clock, of accurately mapping time. So we had longitude, like the Greeks had it, but they had a very basic version of it. It was no way able to do the little party trick of being able to accurately project in a real 3D space. So this is weird. This is like, okay, well, how, if we had the clock here and it's showing up on even older source maps to the 1500s, it points to the idea that those ancient seafarers had a way of mapping time before we sort of reinvented it again. Now, the center point, the azimuth thought, has to have like a center point where it focuses on. And this guy was like, well, there's a theory that the center point of the Piri Reis Map could be Giza, Egypt, which is like, oh wow, the movie continues. So if this is correct, it would point out that the map makers were able to accurately project out using advanced longitude, accurate longitude. So the dude who made the CAD map, he measured the longitude, or he did like a whole bunch of math that like lost me. I watched this video like 5 times, being like, I'm gonna get it. And then I didn't really get it, but I got the gist of what he was saying. That basically he measured 2 points on the map, and they were accurate to with the percent when you were projecting it out. And the distance on the map, when you put the Piri Reis on the globe, between Cairo and the North Pole is exactly the same as the North Pole on the rose compass that's on the surviving rose compass that's on the map, and it's the same distance between the rose compass to Cairo. It's creating like a weird pie thing. Here it is in big. And yes, so if you center the Piri Reis Map on Giza in Cairo, the point of the map which really lines up, which is the west coast of Africa and the very point of North America, they align in the exact same way that it should do. It's turning up like super correct. And then the map is starting to warp in exactly the right places. So personally, I think that this isn't a map of Antarctica on the bottom, but it's almost just as cool because it's showing real evidence that seafarers, before we allow seafarers to be seafarers, that there was something going on in ancient source maps. And I wish we had the other 2, because imagine, who knows what's on the other like 2/3 of this map. Okay, now we get on to out-of-place artifacts, which just blows my mind. All over the world, you get these ancient, like super old artifacts or structures, and they have like a vibe to them, like an aesthetic, If IKEA was going to do like megalithic aesthetic, this would be it. So you've got ancient Japan and ancient Egypt, and some structures in like Central America, and they sort of like share the same. It was almost like the same dude designed them, or woman. Let's not be sexist. Right, we've got the Assyrian. The top is, again, also ancient Japan. You've got this really weird bowl that is, when you first look at it, you're not that impressed because you're like, oh, it's just like bent pottery, I could make that. And then you realize that it's carved out of stone, out of really hard, complicated stone, and we don't know how the hell these things were made. And what's even more crazy is that the bottom one was from my first trip to Egypt. You're just walking in the Cairo Museum, everyone's running to like the main things you look at in the museum, and the big statues. No one's looking at this little like dusty old cabinet that almost hasn't been opened in like 50 years. And this stuff's just living in there with no one looking at it until us now. And I think that this is where a lot of like the secret sauce is. And Ben's doing a fantastic job in pioneering the effort to really get this stuff scanned and looked at and like studied in a deeper way. You got Saqqara, you got the schist disc. Be very careful how you say that, as it comes out wrong. Karnak is a really cool temple because it's a complete onion of like different time periods, and you've got stuff that's like super precise granite cut megalithic-y stuff, and then you right down to like new things. It's like an onion. And interesting, when I went to EdFu, remember I said that there was this like text that sort of said the Atlantis story without mentioning the word Atlantis. Weirdly, the guide that was there, and I was really grilling him about it. I was like, "Do you think it's Atlantis? Is there anything you can tell me that it could be Atlantis?" And he was like, "Well, actually, the story, like the traditional story, is that the pyramid shape and the obelisk shape came from, in the Egyptian culture, they say that the pyramid shape and the obelisk came from that island of the gods that disappeared, and they rebirthed the civilization in the dynasties that we acknowledge is the 2.0. But it's weird that he said that. It was weird that he mentioned that the pyramid shape and the obelisk shape came from the time before, because they are the ones that really fit in with this weird, like, smooth, ergonomic, almost like minimalistic, futuristic. That's what I'm going to call this style. Again, ancient Japan, really cool. I did a lot of research on this, and I think I discovered what it is. I think it's the bunker from Lost. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on there. I'll put it up for peer review, but yeah, okay. And then there's like the idea that like the older something is, it tends to follow the idea, I'm losing my mic, that the older the structures are, the bigger and more megalithic it is. Like it's almost more impressive the older you get. And then when you really analyze the timeline of particularly Egypt, you see this weird decline where they start using smaller stones, and they're beautiful and amazing. And some of my favorite temples are like the New Kingdom temples, but they're impressive in a very different way. They're just absolutely covered from floor to ceiling in hieroglyphs and reliefs and stories, whereas there's some older stuff that's just completely bare and barren, and its beauty and its awe comes in just the sheer size of it. Like this, which is the pregnant lady of Lebanon, because of course there's nothing bigger than a pregnant lady. So, and these pots, these really weird pots that, again, if you go to Ben's channel, he's all over the pots. But there's thousands of them, and they're only found, again, at the very, very early beginnings of the dynasties. And what impressive, that they are not pottery. Repeat, they are not pottery. These things are carved somehow. And they come in all different shapes and sizes, but they are all like equally as perfect and symmetrical and beautiful. And what's really confusing is that they're put in like a cabinet with other bits of pottery and things from the time, other sort of vases and things which are like nowhere near. It's very clear, which one is sober and which one's drunk, if you know what I mean. And how they date them, like literally officially how they date them, is by either the grave they were found in, which personally I don't think dates something. That's just like the earliest time that it was buried. Doesn't say when it was made, or inscriptions on them. So there are these inscriptions. So here we are. This is the dude that apparently made this pot, and it almost becomes laughable when you're going around Egypt and you're looking at the inscriptions that the museum gets the dating of the object from, and I'm like, something doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem. Someone's telling me that the dude who did that didn't make the whole thing, and really the only answer to the argument that I get is like, well, it was different people made them, different people tagged the names on them, and that was just what they did. And I'm like, really, that's the highest skill that you could get on carving your name? I mean, imagine making like a whole car and then just like getting your 2-year-old to like scribble your number plate on. You'd be like, no. So yeah, just briefly touching on Ben's work. Recently, they were able to like scan a vase that was in private collection. So really cool ability. And the stuff that the numbers that are coming, I had a guy come up to me yesterday talking about the numbers that are encoded and the sacred geometry and the precision work that are coming out of these objects, out of the early like second dynasty tombs. It's unbelievable. So yeah, there was Ben doing his thing. And these really are like an actual smoking gun, because at the moment there's really nothing that can answer what's going on. All we know is that we have blaringly obvious evidence that we do not know what the hell was going on back then. Oh, and these are the lids. This is great. So there are there's the pots, and these are the lids in the Cairo Museum that the Egyptians made to obviously put stuff in. I was like, that's embarrassing, just take them out. You know what I mean? Like, that's not, this one, again, pretty cool. It's made of super, super hard rock, and you can see that it's like millimeters thin. You can kind of dodge around in the cabinet and have a look, and these things are almost like translucent. The stone is so thin, yet they were supposedly carved by hand, like crazy. And this guy, look at this. And the tag there. This is fun. So this is the oldest statue of that we have of a sitting pharaoh, Second Dynasty. And this dude's in the Cairo Museum as well. And beautifully made, beautifully amazing statue. And I asked, like, oh, cool, so how did you get the date there of, how did you get the date of 2000? They're like, oh, can you see it's inscribed at the bottom? You can see everything about the pharaoh. And I'm like, that's the reason we attribute this statue to that pharaoh, is that inscription. Okay, I was like, is there a possibility that this item may be a legacy item, and that maybe the Egyptians inherited something, and that perhaps the whole aesthetic of the ancient Egyptians as we know them, perhaps they adopted it, like in the same way that we'll see what Kim Kardashian's wearing, and then we'll copy it. I was like, could it be possible that the Egyptians were like Kim Kardashianing from the time before? And yeah, there we go, work in schist. And that's the dodgy plate dude. Looks like it's melted. It's quite fun. Okay, recap. So we've got the Younger Dryas Comet, we're coming into land. Thank you. Impact, lining up with the timeline for the Atlantean demise. We've got ancient maps showing use of advanced mapping cartography. They could sail around. We've got artifacts from prehistory showing mind-boggling craftsmanship and accuracy not replicated until pretty much now. And even now, we would struggle to make some of these items. Matching styles of architecture and symbology from Egypt, Japan, Lebanon, South Africa, Easter Island, Australia, Turkey. It's all looking very designed. An emerging proof that we've really, really underestimated pre-6000 BC. I remember at school, like, really being told that civilization started only in the Middle East, and it was very hardly aligned, almost to the Bible, with the 6000 BC timeline, and nothing could possibly ever come before that. It just simply wasn't possible. And then they're like, oh no, wait, Göbekli Tepe. Oh no, wait, actually humans have been alive so much longer than we ever perceived that they could be. And even recently, like, I haven't fully looked into it, but just literally this week, I saw an article about in ancient India, they found an potential ancient civilization there that goes back to 8000 BC, and I'm thinking, hey, hold on, Atlantis was only supposed to be like, what, 9,500? So that's really not that far away from what we're emerging. And if I was going to place some money, I would say that in the next 10 years, we are going to be finding more and more and more of these sites that really make the sort of marry the timeline from this mythical Atlantean age to what we know as like hard fact. I think they're going to start blurring together. So what might it have looked like? That's what I want to know, because I can see when I'm looking, once you know what you're looking for, and you're looking for this sort of like minimalistic, almost futuristic aesthetic, and it keeps popping up all over the world in the oldest stuff, I was like, well, what could it have looked like? So I downloaded AI and thought I'd have a go, which was actually really, really hard because I realized that AI doesn't know what I'm talking about, because AI has no reference for what I'm talking about. So I wrestled for many an hour trying to find some visuals, but I found some cool stuff, so I wanted to share it. We've got buildings and objects. This is heavily inspired by, I inserted like the schist disc. There we are. And all of the out-of-place objects to give what this is also based off the ruins of the inside of a pyramid in Egypt. And this is potentially, again, we're just really releasing our imaginations here and being like, okay, I think that the lost civilization that we could potentially be looking for, it would look something like a mixture of all of the artifacts that we find in the ancient sites. And it was interesting that AI was turning up some things like this, which happened to look a lot like Petra from Jordan, and also the Barabar Caves in India. If you don't know what that is, definitely Google the Barabar Caves. They are almost, I think, probably even more impressive than some of the stuff in Egypt. There are these caves that mathematically inside, they are polished to a surface that is so smooth to the human eye, they become translucent. The camera team that went to shoot the documentary out in Barabar, they said they were struggling to film just how smooth and how amazing these polished granite caves were, because the camera was picking up the stone behind the polished granite. The polished granite was almost like see-through to the camera, and they were like looking with their eyes and then looking with the camera, and they're like, this looks awful, like this is not what we want to show people. And it was interesting that the AI started to look a bit like the Barabar Caves, and I did not import a Barabar into this. The granite, okay, cool. So again, going with the idea that the original Egyptian pharaohs of those first dynasties, that maybe they got their aesthetic. You're gonna have to get it from somewhere. People always copy, you know what I mean? They always look at someone and start a trend, everyone starts wearing one shoe like backwards or whatever, and everyone starts to copy it. So I think this is a dude. No, it's not a dude. I mean, it could be a dude, no judgment. But this is possibly lady dude. Again, using that like minimalistic, almost futuristic stuff covered in gold. This was, ancient statues, ancient gods. Who were they trying to replicate? Who were they trying to look at? The guy on the left has got like 20 fingers. That's weird. This weird object is an amalgamation that AI took of all of the objects, and I was like, that's weird, I don't know what it is, but then so is the schistus. We're looking at the exact same thing, as confusing as this image is. Same thing with the schistus. Like, what did it do? It's probably religious. It was probably a very sacred religious box. Yeah, it was really hard. AI does not like when you try and input tropical plants or foliage or greenery and the sea at the same time. For some reason, it just won't do it, and it just looks like a puddle. So here we are. I started putting more like cosmology into it, and it started getting pretty epic. Now, I have a theory, and this is totally just from my own brain, that a lot of this older megalithic stuff, the reason why it looks so different to anything else later in all the other cultures is they cover, the latest stuff they cover with hieroglyphics and imagery and carvings, but all of the old stuff is like completely smooth and pristine and almost boring. Like there's literally nothing on them. The pyramid, everything like that. But then we talk about in Plato's Atlantis about how the main temples were plated entirely with gold and oracle. So I was like, cool, so what if maybe that's why? Maybe anything that used to be covered in gold and silver and oracle, and maybe that's why people have recycled. It's so hard to imagine, even in like ancient Egypt, so much of it has been recycled by other cultures and the Romans and the Arabs, and they've literally would take stuff and rip it off and reuse it. And so we see like the bare minimum skeleton of what is really there. So I was like, I have a feeling that maybe some of the old stuff once upon a time could have been coated in golds and metals, and that's why it's completely pure, because perhaps the gold or the decoration and whatever was on the gold, and that's gone, or it's rusted. So yes, back in time, maybe these statues and everything were looking super shiny. And then all this stuff, the aesthetic, it leans really well into like Blade Runner. So I started putting like Blade Runner, ancient Atlantis Blade Runner stuff, and I just think it looks awesome. I was like, yes, exactly. And this was, I thought was cool. So if something happens and the water really does start to subside, and because anything that we lost when all of the sea levels rose, that could still be down there, like really minimal effort and studying has happened all along those coastlines and out into the sea. So if it ever did go down, we would probably start to see like Stonehenges like rising out of the oceans, and it would be super cool. Again, here this is looking like Star Wars, which is cool. This I was like, oh my God, what if you were a person, just chilling at home, and then you got the Younger Dryas deluge coming at you? That's probably what they saw. And then I got a bit cheeky and was like, oh my God, I'm gonna put myself in AI. Yeah. So this is me, Atlantean princess. That's fun. Oh, now here's my bloopers, because again, AI was like sending me. I was like, circular city. I would like a circular city with mountains, and it gave me that. And I'm like, what the hell is that? When people walk in, okay, like a, and there we go. Again, really not useful. A literal circle city, designed, patented by me. And again, this one I was like, this is not what I was really looking for, but they were cool anyway. These kind of. Also, one thing that AI does not know how to do, when you put anything like, or any reference that is in the past, ancient Egyptian, it will automatically make it look like mashed up and old and ancient. And I'm like, no, I want to see it new. So that's something that AI is yet to be able to understand when you want to see like as it was. Again, this was super cool, but didn't look like the megalithic structures that I'm looking like. It looked like something in India or something. It's beautiful. Again, I don't know what this is, but I was trying to do like golden pyramids, but it looks like something out of Minecraft. I don't know what's going on. And this one's cool. This one kind of came up by accident, and I was like, oh my God, I don't even know what I put in. I forgot what I inputted, but it's super beautiful, and I was like, this is my movie poster. So I accidentally made my movie poster, but now that I look at it, it looks a little bit like Avatar 20, but that's okay. Right, thank you. We got to the end. Thank you for that.